Before there was the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, or the Shanghai Tower in China, or even the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, there was the Willis Tower, the former Sears Tower in Chicago. A tower which at over 1,700 feet to the tip of the antennas held the record for the tallest building in the world for about 2 decades. This is a tower that boasts one of the highest observation decks in the world, making surrounding skyscrapers look like toys. So join me as we make it to the top of this magnificent structure. Our journey begins as I'm walking around downtown Chicago, admiring the beautiful architecture around me. After all, it is Chicago that is the birthplace of the modern skyscraper after the Great Fire of 1871. Chicago's love affair with the skyscraper can even be seen in its alleyways. I finally get the first full glimpse of the Willis Tower, and even an ad of an interesting attraction at the top of this tower that you don't want to miss. In West on Jackson, we have about maybe 2-3 more blocks to the Willis Tower. Coming up, guys. We're almost there. And right before I arrive at the Willis Tower, I pass by one more of these historic raised rail stations which take you back to another time and contrast quite well with the modern environment around it. And at about 1 block away, I had to do a matcha cheers to this iconic structure to keep in tradition with wild travel adventure. And then we arrive at the base of this giant piece of architecture. I had to take a few minutes to admire the beautiful art outside of this tower before finally entering the lobby to make it up to the Skydeck. This tower opened in 1973 and held the record for the world's tallest building for nearly 25 years until the Petronas Towers in Malaysia were built. After admiring the beauty of this lobby, it was time to go down 2 flights of escalators to buy my ticket to the top. After purchasing my ticket, I ran into a massive museum celebrating the tower, as well as the history and the many attributes of the great city of Chicago, which is quite interesting, being that this city has been the second most important city in the country for much of its history. And upon entry, we are treated to an explanation of the municipal flag. The museum then dives into the early history of the city, starting with the 1850s when parts of the city had to be lifted because of the swampy soils to allow pipes to be laid. In the following section, we fast forward the clock about 20 years where supposedly a cow kicked a lantern, causing the Great Fire of 1871, which is a very, very painful part of this city's history, supposedly burning over 3 square miles and leaving over 100,000 people homeless. But of course, a flower blooms where there are ashes, and Chicago was determined to rebuild by using better materials to build taller and stronger structures, leading to the birth of the modern-day skyscraper. This new style of building resulting from the Great Fire of Chicago, which used a lot of steel, became known as the Chicago School of Architecture. So naturally, the next section is dedicated to display of the many architectural achievements of Chicago from the 1800s to modern day. Chicago is one of the most famous cities globally in terms of architecture. So for somebody who's into architecture, this city is full of eye candy. And this eye candy ranges from more historic structures such as the famous Wrigley Building, modeled after an even more historic structure in Sevilla, Spain, as well as the historical Merchandise Mart where one can sometimes view a phenomenal light show, all the way to more modern structures such as the famous Marina Towers, which we talked about and saw in the last episode, and eventually to the pinnacle of Chicago architecture, which is the tallest structure in the city as well as one of the tallest in the world. In this next section, we are treated to many mind-boggling statistics about the Willis Tower. For example, this tower has enough cables to go around the world 3 times and even has enough floor space to fill 101 football fields. Not to mention the 107 elevators that serve this massive structure, or how this tower is designed to sway up to 3 feet under maximum load. We then run into a description of the ledge, which is a very exciting attribute of this building that we will be discovering later in this video. From this glass enclosed balcony, we will be able to enjoy views from over 1,300 feet. We conclude this section with the description of the antenna, which bring the height of the entire structure to over 1,700 feet. The next section focuses on Chicago's metro rail system, which happens to be one of the oldest in the world. Here we are treated to a fantastic simulation of what it would be like to ride a CTA train in the various neighborhoods of Chicago.
Proszę powitać start. Now, Chinatown.
After this beautifully animated exhibit of Chicago's passenger rail system, we had to move on to the next section. And the next section is dedicated to something we all love, and that is food. More specifically, food that is popular in Chicago. And of course, out of all these foods, 2 stand out. The first is Chicago's hot dog, which surprisingly does not come with any ketchup and is served with a bright green relish. And the second and probably the most popular food from Chicago is its famous deep dish pizza, which is served more like a deep pie with a lot of ingredients, as well as a sauce being served on top of the cheese instead of underneath, which is what we see with other pizzas. This next section is dedicated to the musical culture and history of Chicago. This section also displays the many venues in Chicago, both outdoor and indoor. We then enter Chicago's Hall of Fame, starting with, you guessed it right, Michael Jordan. And even the Obamas, as well as Oprah Winfrey. In the next section, we are treated to representation of Chicago's famous comedy venue, the Second City, whose name is symbolic of Chicago being the second most important American city throughout much of its history. The following section is dedicated to the many Chicago landmarks, starting with local famous murals representing things like their sports teams, as well as their iconic area code. This is followed by an artistic representation of the many physical landmarks of the city, including the Navy Pier Ferris wheel that we saw in the last episode, as well as the famous Wrigley Field, which is the home of the Chicago Cubs. Not to mention the beautiful and famous Cloud Gate, known to many as Chicago's Bean. We are then treated to another very beautiful animation on the city, so check this out. after being entertained by this very interesting and animated museum on Chicago and this tower, it was finally time to go up to the Skydeck to enjoy some of the best views in the nation. And as you're about to see, the ride-up is arguably just as interesting as the views we're about to experience. We finally make it into the elevator, and as we start our epic climb to over 1,300 feet at the top, we are treated to a very interesting animation that compares our current height to famous landmarks of the world. At an elevation of 1,353 feet, it was now time to check out the views from the top of this magnificent structure. We start off with the south side view, where you can see the massive Dan Ryan Freeway, which is basically Chicago's main north and south freeway. Next, we turn slightly southeast, where we see a lot of new developments stretching south from downtown, as well as Chinatown. As we turn eastward, we see the massive Lake Michigan in front of us, as well as other dominant towers of the skyline, such as the Aon Center, the Trump Tower, as well as the John Hancock Center. And as we turn to the northwest, we see the Ogilvy Transportation Center, which is one of the busiest rail centers in the US. And now it was time to check out the most exciting part of this journey, and that is the ledge, which is a series of glass-enclosed balconies that give you some captivating and slightly nerve-wracking views of the city in front of you and below you. With only 1.5 inches of glass separating you from the ground over 1,300 feet below you, these are views that are very hard to forget. When I made it back downstairs, I ran into one of the most famous local restaurants serving Chicago-style pizza. And of course, I felt like I had to try Chicago's famous pizza at least one more time before I left the city. This pizza alone makes it worth coming back to Chicago. Stay tuned for the next episode as we start discovering the massive and very interesting Grant Park, which is full of entertainment and some of the most famous sculptures in the nation. Not to mention world-class museums, as well as one of the largest fountains in the world.